Okay, okay, great. So today's session, I'm doing on essay writing. And essentially for the first and second year essays, I remember being a bit lost on like how to get the best set of marks and how to frame essays a bit more. So we're just going to kind of run through that. No. Okay, so the plan for today, we're just going to run through some general information for first and second year. So, kind of how the exams are based, what bits include essay writing. We won't spend too long on that. Going through the marking criteria for the exams, because it kind of does vary between first and second year. Some general advice on how to choose questions and maybe plan for questions. And yeah, go on to essay planning. So, for the first BM part one, which is essentially the first and second year exams. For first years, you get one paper per module, so that's the OB, physiology, and biochem papers. And they're from this year, they've been split into two sections. The first bit being MCQs, and which covers kind of the core syllabus, and then you have to do one essay in about an hour from a choice of four. And then for second years, it's kind of stayed the same as it was previously, where you do part A's and part B's, with part B's being the three essays that you do, except compared to first year, it'd be in 3 hours, so still an hour per question. And for psychology, you'll be doing one essay alongside MCQ, so sort of a bit like the first year papers. Um, I guess just to bear in mind, you get to choose three questions from a set of 10 for the second year questions. Cool. So, what did the examiners want? So I've kind of brought up the mark scheme. So the left-hand side has what first years will be marked on. So and then the second year essay marking criteria stayed broadly the same, except compared to first year, you'll get up to 4 bonus points compared to the 6 point marking scale. Essentially, they kind of cover the same thing. So just for your reference, I've put anything in green as like things that kind of make a really good essay. Yellow kind of just being things that will get you a comfortable pass. And then orange slash red, like the orangey color that I've got up, just kind of putting up what will get you marks maybe taken away or what will have constitute a weaker answer. So, in simple terms, you'll broadly pass if you answer the question completely and you don't demonstrate a major misunderstanding. The only kind of caveat to this is that people who get vivas tend to usually get it because in the question they might have answered it fully and the vast majority is correct. But if it's a fundamental misunderstanding of, say, the science, they will bring you back for a viva, which is why your essay will get marked down. To kind of do well, I kind of picked out some quotes. So they've got this stuff about well organized, a clear, irrelevant answer. So essentially, I've taken this as you need an essay plan. I'm personally someone who likes using subheadings between first to third year when I wrote essays. It's kind of contentious whether you're supposed to do this, and I don't think it really matters. But I find that at least when you're writing an essay, if you have a subheading to work towards, you're less likely to go off on a tangent and stay focused. And this kind of goes into the whole making it flow. So you want the ideas to have like separations that you're talking about discrete things, but an overall theme to tie together nicely. Um, there was this quotation of exhibits extensive knowledge and insight. So to kind of put this as going beyond what's in just the lecture slides and the core syllabus. So whether that's you've kind of done some extra reading in your tutorials or discussed anything with your tutors, to maybe even citing maybe the experiments that are in the lecture slides, or if there is a um kind of interesting thing to mentioning it. Um, and then this goes into appropriate use of experimental evidence. So this was something that I remember I used to get quite confused by because I would throw in something about a knockout mouse and sometimes I wouldn't get the experimental points. And that's because they want you to kind of use evidence to establish a point. So if you're talking about a key physiological process such as like the Krebs cycle in first year, they want to know they'll probably want how it was discovered, because it was quite a landmark experiment. So any landmark experiment usually bring it in. Or if there's a particular point you're arguing, whether it's like a certain transporter in physiology being really important, if there's an experiment that's either discovered it or shown why it works the way it does, you can kind of establish what you're arguing, providing some reasoning behind it. And then there's this bit about integrative approaches and having a perceptive discussion. So integrative is quite broad in the sense that I think it ties into just having a good essay plan and maybe tying things together. So whether or not you're thinking about kind of systems as a whole and not just like isolated, very niche things. So kind of putting it into the context of the whole body. Um, and then having a perceptive discussion. This is slightly more of a thing that you'll tend to do for second year essays, where some of the topics will be a little bit more vague and the science is not as well understood. So an example would be anesthesia. So I think a common title is discuss the mechanisms of anesthesia and how they work to act on the body. So that's kind of two limbs to the essay question. So the first bit being the mechanisms, which aren't actually that well understood. There are kind of theories, and you'll probably learn the theories in your lectures, but what they'll probably want to get extra marks and what they'll give like bonus points for is if you've discussed like some of the evidence that kind of conflicts each other and why you think that is, and maybe putting your own little spin on it and what you think makes the most sense. But it's quite a nuanced thing. So common essay pitfalls. This could be generally, so I think the most common one is that you'll do a tutorial essay and it will be an exam question, but you learn that essay plan rather than planning essays as a whole for a topic. So you're gonna realistically, your exam questions aren't going to be what you've got in a tube. If it is, that's great, you'll probably smash that question, and that's a nice thing that you can save some time on. But like more often than not, it will be something you've covered or you know well enough from when you've revised, but you're going to have to adapt it to have that nuance that they've kind of put in the question. So it's making sure you answer the question that's on the page and not the question that you want it to be. Um, from examiner reports, they continually kind of, it's a recurring theme that they were like, oh, sadly, students didn't go beyond what was on lecture materials, particularly, I think, in physiology. I remember it being said. So referencing just lecture material, I think there's an element of balancing it that if you want to comfortably pass, you need to cover the core syllabus content, and that is to some extent from your lecture slides or the key textbooks, but before you kind of go into the extra cool or interesting clinical bits or experimental bits. And kind of linking to that, there's going too niche or going off on a bit of a tangent. I remember again in some examiner reports, it will be a question, say, discuss the pathways of the basal ganglia, and people will bring in a condition, rightly so, and then they might go off on like treatment. So you can stimulate the subthalamic nucleus in the treatment of Parkinson's, but whether or not that's necessarily relevant to the question is not useful. If you go on too long about all these different drug targets, because then you're taking away from what the question was actually asking. If you add it in, it's knowing when to be brief and when to explore these things more. Because if the question was discuss the treatments and how they work in reference to the pathways of the brain, you're answering the question really fully. And then poor structure, so kind of chaotically organized stuff, or just if you're describing something, it doesn't quite make sense. Moving on. So some general advice on how to plan slash picking questions. So for timing, I'd personally recommend taking 10 minutes, which is actually quite a while, to plan your essay. So plucking the bits that you've probably revised for a topic. This is kind of the point that I'm trying to drill home in this, is that when you're revising, don't go too niche in terms of just one specific thing. You want to kind of bring in a topic. So for example, thinking about conduction in the heart overall or the cardiac cycle broadly, rather than this bit of one specific thing. Um, so take 10 minutes to plan, think through what exactly you want to include, and having a bullet point plan of exactly what you want to put. 40 minutes to write it out because you're typing, you'll easily be able to bash it out. And then 5 minutes just checking over everything makes sense, any diagrams that you need to like insert in, etc., on Inspira. Um, Making sure you answer the question fully. It's actually quite surprising under time pressure how easily you cannot do this, slash if you're just pushed for time. And I think if you're planning thoroughly, taking those few extra minutes compared to the 5 where you're just kind of scrambling different random points down, which is what I used to do. That's what I did in my first year collections. I remember it didn't go fantastically for me in some points. I think there's an element of picking things that you find interesting when you're revising to plan for Part B essays, because you realistically can't cover the whole syllabus in complete depth for Part B. So picking things that you generally find interesting and common will work well. So I think there's a bit of an offset of don't just do things particularly that you enjoy. Do play the exam game a little bit. Look at previous past papers and exam reports. See what comes up frequently, what they think people tend to answer badly. They will probably ask a question again if it was answered pretty poorly, like over a few years, because they know it's an area that they need to examine on a bit more. Also, when you're making essay plans while revising, the tendency I used to have is that I want to write loads and loads down, but it's not conducive given in the exams itself, you're not going to write more than 1,500 words, and they don't really expect a really lengthy 2,000, 3,000 word essay that you might even produce for a tutorial. So you're going to have to kind of cull down what you're doing, making sure you have enough depth and you're not just kind of saying very isolated statement-y things of different things. And I'd say when you're planning, using the lecture slides as a starting point of what needs to be covered and what you need to restructure, because sometimes what's covered in a lecture makes the most sense to be taught it, but not for writing an essay. So you might need to reshift things. Like I kind of mentioned before, using the syllabus as a guide is also really helpful. And then just some general resources that are quite nice are recommending readings from your tutors. Your tutors know usually which textbooks are best to look at and are credible sources. Something that I get really didn't really use until kind of the latter half of second year was reviews in academic papers. So Nature do reviews often on topics that are examined quite frequently, and they'll go through it in slightly more of a palatable way and a slightly more concise way than a textbook might. So it might be worth looking at reviews to kind of get even nice diagrams to explain things as well, and you can kind of copy them into your notes. If you are kind of pushing for the higher marks, looking up for any contested areas of research, like I was mentioning with the anesthesia stuff, where the mechanisms aren't that well understood, maybe having 1 or 2 lines tied in quite nicely about that sort of stuff will kind of push your mark from the comfortable pass to the 8, 9, 10 score that if you're looking for it, it's worth it. And diagrams, I'm a big advocate for them. It saves a lot of time in exams to draw out something. So the Krebs cycle, if you can draw it out and then just put a sentence of the Krebs cycle shows is the production of NAD, like has the NADH produced through a series of steps. This is shown in figure blah blah blah, and then you just reference that, and it saves you describing, oh, this component is turned into this, etc., etc. Same thing goes for like I think for metabolism in biochem in first year, I remember I drew loads of diagrams. So there's like glucose transport as well. When insulin's released, you could just write something of insulin promotes glucose uptake into cells via GLUT4 receptors. Figure 1 demonstrates this process, and you can kind of save yourself writing a whole like 4-line spiel and just quickly scribble out a diagram, which shouldn't take too long. It probably is a bit quicker than kind of writing out the steps and potentially saving yourself some muddling. So here is a general structure for an essay plan. I've kept this relatively broad, but tried to include what should be in each part of the essay. So in the introduction, you want to give some general background. So if the essay is on a particular condition or condition, say like asthma, you want to just say asthma affects this percentage of the population. It's a nice opening sentence, gives some context of why this essay is even important. Define key terms. So depending on like if you're talking about the mechanisms of asthma, there are different kind of theories slash mechanisms of asthma, that being like atopic, so allergic asthma. Um, there's immunogenic, which is more IgE mediated, etc. And then what the essay's arguing. So kind of at the end, you usually want to put something like this essay will discuss blah, 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 and then kind of maybe put in the bullet point, the kind of subheading title that you're going to have and the main point that you're coming to at the end of your essay. Almost a bit like an abstract of a paper. You want to try and emulate that because that will give the reader a nice overview and it shows that you've thought this essay through quite well. In terms of the paragraphs, like I've said, break it up into different chunks and follow that. So I kind of went by this structure with my paragraphs. So describe the process, so covering your core syllabus. Then you want to include like how it was discovered or how you know this mechanism is the way it is. So any landmark experiments, any key experiments that you found when you were doing your reading, etc. And then how it goes wrong, because in first and second year, you tend to learn more so the physiological processes. So your clinical is quite easy to tie in because more often than not, there's either some inherited mutation or some sort of general defect that occurs that is a clinical medical thing. Um, Reference your diagram. So I kind of talked through this earlier, so I'm not gonna save. I'm gonna save that. And then your conclusion. So you want to summarize the points you've made, and then if it's relevant to the question, add your opinion in. If it's something which is contested, maybe say, based off what I've spoken of in this essay, I believe this mechanism is the current leading theory for this thing. So I think another thing is experimental evidence. It's quite difficult, I think, in first and second year because you're not always sure what exactly you need to put in. So I had a tendency to just put in the results and cite the paper when I did tutes, and then I just kind of throw some results in. And quite often it's hard for the examiner to understand whether you know what's went on in this experiment without you describing exactly what the methods were. So you need to hopefully know the technique. If it's kind of an in vitro one, it's nice to know the cell line and i.e. basically the scientific model they've used to represent what goes on in human physiology. Then any results, so whether they're positive or negative findings, what was the key finding and what this actually means and how it proved what you're talking about. And then this is like kind of like it's a very low level critique. You don't need to like sit there and tear this experiment apart. That's more of a third year skill. What does whether or not it kind of whether the findings of this were supported by subsequent studies. So if you can remember the citation, that's great. If you don't remember citations, it's fine. If so long as you describe the experiment in enough detail, it should be okay. So I've used this example from I think it will be a second year topic that is like exercise physiology. So this was one of the ones I've just copied this from an essay plan that I made in second year. So it was the role of central command in kind of the cardiorespiratory response in exercise. And essentially, I was arguing that the brain and not just the cortex, it's acts in controlling kind of the heart rate and ventilation. So the model in this being in pink is there are these paralyzed decorticated cats and they were these were electrically stimulated in their subthalamic nuclei. And then I go on to the findings. So they then found that the heart rate ventilation and mean arterial pressure increased, as well as phrenic nerve activity. And this then demonstrated quite clearly that despite not having a cortex in these cats, the midbrain nuclei specifically act in cardiovascular control. And then I've kind of put another finding, which then corroborated another study, which corroborated with another study that was done at some point in time. So yeah, I appreciate that this was relatively brief. I've kind of left it open for any questions. So seeing as only one person's here, I guess we can stop the recording and take any questions.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the recording. So